again, in this session, we're going to be looking at the message of John the Baptist, which he addresses very generally to the crowds, but also quite specifically there's something for the Pharisees and for the Sadducees, as well as for tax collectors and for soldiers. And then he finishes it all with a testimony, his first testimony to the Messiah who is to come. So let's make a start with the text. We left off last time with the crowds from Judea, Jerusalem and all around the Jordan kind of coming down to John as he's there ministering in the wilderness. And as we pick it up, we're going to be using a text today that's been blended together from Matthew 3, which is verses 7 to 11, Luke 3, verses 7 to 18, and one verse from Mark, which is 1 verse 7. So you can actually download it. I'm going to be reading from the text, and we'll put it up on the video behind me, or perhaps in front of me, work out how we fit it all in. But if you want to, you can go to my website, you can download this along with the notes for this session and all the others. But let me read it, and we'll kind of talk into it as we go through, rather than reading it all up front and then coming back to it. So now he said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him. So if you've got my integrated text, you'll notice that first phrase is highlighted in green, because ostensibly it comes from Luke's gospel. So the crowds are coming out to be baptized by him. And that's how we finished last time. And so they're coming out, they're excited, because suddenly we have somebody who is prophesying, a bit like one of those Old Testament prophets. And we want to go and find out what's going on. As we said, particularly if it's kind of one of the feast times, that all the pilgrims coming from the east are going to be kind of coming through roughly where John is doing what he's doing. But even those who have come up from the south or even from the north into Jerusalem will probably hear about this guy who's preaching out in the wilderness. About a day's journey to get out from Jerusalem to where John is baptizing, Bethbara, as we thought about the other session. And so they kind of come on out and they want to hear what's going on. But once they get there, it seems that they are actually getting baptized because they're coming to be baptized by him. They are participating in his message, which we're going to be exploring a little bit more as we go through. What is his message? But then I've kind of qualified that in this kind of integrated text with then the words from Matthew, which is saying, having seen many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism. Now, originally when I was putting them together, I kind of blended them all into a single statement, but actually I realised there's something slightly distinct, because the crowds are coming to be baptised, but the Pharisees and the Sadducees are coming to his baptism. In other words, they're coming to the meeting, they're not participating. And that distinction is quite important, which is why I put in little square brackets in the integrated text, to see his baptism, just to make it really clear. They're not coming to be baptized, they're just coming to the event. And Matthew in particular, he sets up for us this kind of axes of power, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are going to kind of run, to start with, towards in the background. But actually by the time we get to the end of the story of Jesus, his ministry years, it is, of course, that same axis of power, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that end up having Jesus tried and executed. And so Matthew has brought them in nice and early. Now, just a quick kind of interesting aside on the datings of the Gospels. Those who are the majority, who take the view that the Gospels are all written post the destruction of Jerusalem, of which I am not one. If you've watched the other videos, you'll see some of my logic. Here's another little bit. But interestingly, the Sadducees don't appear that much in the Synoptic Gospels, or John's Gospel either. They're not explicitly referenced. And this is presented as evidence for a late dating of the Gospels. But as we're going to see, if you look at the logic carefully, actually the whole thing turns around. And so those who use the lack of reference to the Sadducees in the Gospels as an evidence that the Gospels were written later, I'll explain why in a second, actually that argument kind of gets hoisted on its own petard, because there's a kind of a simple little step that when you spot it, you realise it actually means the total opposite. So let me explain what I mean. So what they say is the Sadducees, because the Sadducees were part of the ruling class. We're going to look at their history in a minute. So just accept that at the moment. They're part of the ruling class of the temple, and they're politically very important as well. And so when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, the Sadducees were pretty much wiped out. It seems that theologically they kind of survive, and they become another group whose name I can't remember, but I'll remember it after I've finished talking, so I'll put it somewhere on the screen so you can check them out. And apart from about 2 references in the Talmuds, they're never referred to again after the destruction of Jerusalem. And so the logic you see of those who say the Gospels are written later, they say, you see, the Sadducees only appear a handful of times in the Gospels, and that is because they weren't written till after the destruction of Jerusalem, and everyone's forgetting about them now. And that's the way it goes. The problem is that there are plenty of other good reasons why they only appear a small amount, which we'll think about. The problem is that the one event that appears with the Sadducees in it, in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels, is the event where they are introduced, and it's said, and the Sadducees, who, by the way, don't believe in the resurrection, they don't believe in an angel or anything spiritual like that. that little verse, which appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's Matthew chapter 2. I can't think. I think it's 22. I think it's 22. Anyway. But that event, in that event, the Sadducees are referred to in the present tense quite explicitly. See, so that's where the problem comes in. Because the one occasion that all of the Gospels refer to them, it says this: they say there is no resurrection, and it doesn't say they said. See, if they had been wiped out and they didn't exist anymore, you would write, the Pharisees used to say they said in the past, but they don't anymore. You see, they're writing as if the Sadducees is a current movement. You hear the way I'm putting it. So they say there is no and it is. They say there is. So say is in the present tense, is in the present tense. In fact, I think in Mark it's in that kind of continuous flowing tense. They are saying there is. It really believes the Sadducees are currently with us. That's what I'm saying. In actual fact, the references to the Sadducees, although there are not many of them, actually kind of testify to an early writing of the Gospels. So why aren't there that many? Well, that's not complicated when we understand who they are. And we are going to unpack them again in a minute. But let's just kind of get the simple things out at this stage, which is the Sadducees are mainly based around Jerusalem, and that's where their power base is. They are built around the temple. They control the temple, the financial activity around the temple, and so on and so forth. And yes, of course, the super wealthy of Jerusalem also have property up in Galilee and elsewhere, so it's not that we will never see them elsewhere outside of Jerusalem, but that's really where they come to the fore. And the Pharisees are much more widely spread in Judea and in Galilee. And so actually where Jesus' ministry, which starts in Galilee, it's not surprising that most of the time we find him interacting with Pharisees. So as I say, most of the occurrences and most of the times where we do meet Sadducees are in Matthew's Gospel. And that again has some logic to it, because do you remember how we saw Mark's Gospel is written in Rome? So in Rome, nobody cares about the nuances, if you like, of Jewish sectarianism, because Josephus tells us that the Sadducees are one of the major 4 divisions. But from a Roman point of view, they're all just Jews. And you can explain the Pharisees kind of nice and simply, because they kind of control the churches, control the synagogues. So Mark isn't really going to be that interested. The one time he does tell us about the Sadducees, he explains who they are, because obviously a Roman audience needs to know. They are a group of Jews who don't believe in the resurrection. And we find exactly the same in Luke. The one time he refers to the Sadducees, because Luke is writing for a gentile church all across the Greek-speaking world, not for a Jerusalem-based church or a Jewish church predominantly, that would all know about these things. And he does exactly the same. It's the same reference. So you can see and understand, it's not complicated to understand why we don't hear the Sadducees referred to explicitly most of the time. Plus, as we're going to see, these divisions, while they're very, very real, from a day-to-day point of view, people still predominantly thought of themselves first as Jewish, not first as being whichever sect. But it's interesting that the Pharisees and the Sadducees actually kind of give birth to what is the third stroke fourth of Josephus's major divisions, which is the Essenes that we were thinking about the other week, and which John might be strongly influenced by. So if we just do a little bit of the backstory, because it just helps at this point, since this is the beginning where they're introduced and they're going to be with us right through to the end. Actually Josephus tells us some stuff, and there it is. I looked it up earlier, and I put a marker in because I'm learning, so I can find it quite quickly. And so I'm just going to read you what Josephus tells us, because it's kind of an interesting story, and it kind of helps us understand, get some colour in the background of the Gospel. So he's writing about the Inter-Testamental period. We've had the battle of the Maccabean revolt, which is the family of the Maccabees, Simon and then Judas Maccabeus, who have won some autonomy and control for Jerusalem and Judea again. And in that context, one of the nephew of Judas Maccabeus is a guy called John, who is also an Aaronite priest, a Zadokite priest. And so he takes hold of the so we're going to pick up his story. It's just interesting, yes, to kind of just take a step back. So the Pharisees, they take their name from a Hebrew word which I can't remember right now, which means to be separated. The Sadducees, actually the Sadduce bit is from Zadok the priest, as in Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, which we sang at the Queen's coronation. You weren't expecting that, were you? I wasn't either. It's probably terrible. The Sadducees, therefore, are actually taking their name from Zadok, and we see that there's a rabbi who has the same name who seems to be associated with them, and it's possible that they didn't actually get called Sadducees until after Zadok the Pharisee, who exists in about 7 BC. And if that is the case, then both the Gospel writers and Josephus used the term in a slightly derogatory way, because he's not a popular rabbi and he causes some trouble. But that's in one sense is a side irrelevance. So understand that the sect itself goes back a long way, and it very clearly identifies itself with Zadok, who was the first priest of the first temple. So Solomon's temple, if you remember, is dedicated by Zadok the priest, and Solomon is anointed by Zadok the priest. And so the Zadokite priests saw their role with the newly established temple that has been rebuilt at the end of the Old Testament. It's been restored under Nehemiah and Ezra. The city has been rebuilt. And so they saw themselves kind of tied back to that old priesthood. But anyway, in that context, what has happened is, as the Jews have returned from diaspora in this intertestamental period, ritual around the temple has started to grow up. Now, while they've been spread out all over the empire, a system of understanding Judaism based around the synagogue, which means to talk together, the talking together. So they come together, they talk together or learn together. It means to learn together, synagogue. So they come together to learn. As the temple starts to grow again in people's minds and its prominence, and that's where the battles all come into play. The Pharisees seem to have started to emerge within the scribal traditions as those who are very devoted to the ritual around the temple. Because there's an awful lot of ritual you can now do in your synagogue, but the things that are very specific to the temple, they starts to kind of emerge. And within that context, we read the kind of the story in Josephus of John Hyrcanus, the nephew of Judas Maccabeus, and what actually happens and what causes the big division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So he says the successes of Hyrcanus, i.e. from a military and political point of view, produced jealousy among the Jews. So what's actually happening is now, you see, the Maccabean family have established governorship again, kind of rulership. And now John has come in, and he's also a priest, and he becomes the high priest. And so he's a high priest who's also the governor. So he's got both types of power, civic power and religious power. And he's holding them both. And the families start to probably present themselves as the fulfillment of verses like in Ezekiel, where it says the turban, which is the priest's hat, and the crown will come together, because here he is. Here is here is John the priest, John Hyrcanus, and he's both priest and he's the ruler. So so among the Jews, the Pharisees though were particularly hostile to this. So those who have seen, if you like, the importance of the temple and have started to really build up a kind of religious following around the rituals of temple. So at first he was a disciple of theirs, so he starts off within that kind of movement. And he was cherished by them. But once he gave a feast for them, and while they were having a good time, Hyrcanus asked them if they had any criticism of the way in which he governed. Dangerous question. And they replied that he was entirely virtuous, which he was delighted to hear. But, there's always the but there was one called Eleazar, and he had a strong temper and enjoyed controversy. And he said, since you're anxious to know the truth, I'm now going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what it's really like. If you really wish to be righteous, give up the high priesthood and be satisfied with governing the people. And it sounds like a challenge, but there's more to it, because he knows that John is going to respond, and he's going to be able to say, if you like, his really nasty point in a minute. So when Hyrcanus asked, why should I give it up? Eleazar is now going to tell him, you see. He said, our elders have told us that your mother was once a captive under Antiochus Epiphanes. Now that doesn't sound terrible, but you have to put it in context. Basically, the women under Antiochus Epiphanes are probably now buying their position by sexual services, become part of the harem, and of course now he's been beaten, they're all back and they're all now happily married. But and that's the way it's understood by John. It's the implication. And according to Leviticus, in chapter 21, verse 14, this is one of the things that precludes. Because basically, if John's mother had been that way, she can't have given birth to someone who's going to be the high priest, you see. So you can't be the high priest because your mother was a bit of a sleep around. She kind of protected herself by selling sex. Sorry to be blunt, I'm just see where these things go, but said in the most kind of gracious, well, she was taken captive by him, wasn't he? So of course he's furious, you see. And then it gets stirred up, you see. There was a Jonathan who was a Sadducee. So, hang on, last week said the Sadducees exist at this point. Well, no, they become concrete at this stage. Well, I guess what it means here, Sadducee, is he is part of the Zadokite priestly line, as is John. So another who is in that line. But at the moment, they are kind of absorbed within the Pharisees, seems to be the picture that we have. So the Sadducees are the Zadokite priest line. The Pharisees is a wider movement of the scribes and the rabbis and so on, who are probably therefore strongly Levitical. But at the moment these exist within there, but now it's going to kind of break off. So he claimed that Eleazar's slanderous statement had the general endorsement of all the Pharisees. This would be evident, he said, if Hyrcanus asked the Pharisees what punishment the man deserved, and if they gave him a severe one, then they were innocent, you see. Because we've been told by Josephus' story, I don't think I read that line, that actually the others didn't agree with him, the other Pharisees didn't. But John now has this litmus test. Okay, let's see what they say if I say I'm going to punish him. And basically, to go on the story, the Pharisees kind of say, well, it's pretty bad that he said that, but it's not something he would kill someone for. And he interprets that as them taking a soft line because they endorse his position. And so the Sadducees, who are, if you like, the priestly caste within Pharisaism, break off and form a separate sect and start a kind of a tussle for power from that period in the 2nd century BC, so right there in the 2nd century BC, 200 years before Jesus. There's a tussle for the kind of the controlling kind of factions. And actually I shouldn't have lost that place, because there's a really nice little quote from Josephus at the end of it, I think. And I lost my place. Oh, here we are. Here he is, yes, that's right. So Hyrcanus became angry, and he joined the Sadducees. In doing so, he drew the people's hatred on himself, since they preferred the Pharisees. The Sadducees were viewed as the party of the few and the wealthy. That's the way Josephus puts it. And that's really what happens, is they end up with all the political power and control of the temple, but the hearts and minds are kind of really owned by the network of Pharisaic rabbis who are spread out all over Jerusalem. Now, it seems to be into that context of all this tussle over power and then a group of priests break off and form the Essene movement. See, so we've got 3 of the 4, and the last one is the Hellenists, who don't play a big part in the ministry story of Jesus, but they do play a big role in the book of Acts, because of course they're the Jews that Paul keeps encountering when he goes. The synagogues spread out all over the Greek-speaking world. So anyway, coming back to the text, that's a long way of getting into the text. First few lines. So Matthew's introduced them because Matthew is the gospel that's written for the immediate Jerusalem, Judea context. It's the early one. Mark doesn't say much about them. Luke doesn't say much about them because they're writing into a gentile context who wouldn't really fully understand the backstory. And so into that context then it goes on. So after saying who's warned you to flee from the wrath to come, so you brood of vipers, who forewarned you to flee from the coming wrath, says John. So produce fruit worthy of changed thinking. Again, that idea of repentance I've kind of translated with the idea of changed thinking. If you thought differently, you should behave differently. And don't presume to begin to say to yourself, we've got Abraham as our father. But I tell you, out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham. And you know, as probably a lot of you will know, actually in Hebrew or in Aramaic, the word for stones is abnaya, whereas the word for children is benaiah. And it's actually only one Hebrew letter different between the two. So it's a kind of a simple sort of a word play rather than a literal miracle that John is expecting God would do. He's just saying, look, those stones aren't that different from you. Only one letter difference, you get the kind of thing. And even now, says John, the axe is set to the root of the tree, so every tree that doesn't produce good fruit is cut down and is cast into the fire. And as you put all of the message together, you brood of vipers, or children of vipers, children of asps. I think the Septuagint translates there's a references to snakes in Isaiah, and I think the Septuagint, if I'm right, actually translates them as brood of snakes or brood of asps. So you kind of, if you like, John is using very much prophetic language, brood of snakes, wrath to come, fruit of repentance, and the axe is laid to the tree. And in the image of a tree being cut down and being because it's fruitless, you find again right the way through the Old Testament prophetic writing. So John is sounding like a prophet. People are coming out to hear about his prophetic message. Something about the way he delivers it is causing a conviction, which means that some of them are now participating in it as they're going into baptism. But there are those who are coming out who traditionally represent, if you like, the power nexus. And are going to be a problem right the way through the Gospels, and he's addressing them too, perhaps with the phrases, the words of vipers. But then the crowds are asking him, saying, what should we do? Now this is really all coming from Luke, because Luke is giving John his slightly wider context in a way that would make sense much more for those who haven't grown up in Jerusalem and not so intimately involved in Judaism. They're just asking what, and so he gives them very practical advice. And so these really would be words of John. As I say, you can see Luke seems very familiar with John. So I suspect he's been sat under the ministry of John the Baptist. I won't revisit the arguments now. So the crowds are saying, what should we do? And here is some very practical solutions. He says, whoever's got 2 tunics, you can share with one who's got none. And whoever's got some food can do the same. And it's interesting, he doesn't just kind of give that response to those who are super wealthy. It's not really about so much the sharing as the heart attitude. I mean, if you're sitting next to someone and they're hungry and you've got food, then just share it. It's about do something that's about reaching out and making connections. If you've got 2 tunics, you can't wear both right now. It doesn't have to have 50 tunics. If you've got 50 tunics, give some away. So if you've just got 2, well, you can do that. Let's start to bond heart to heart. Remember how we saw he turns the hearts of the fathers to look again to the children. He turns the hearts of the children. This is the end of Malachi. And there's about reconnecting, you see, family to family, brother to brother. Let's start to care for each other. It's right there, the message into the community. So there is a message of love. It's not just pure judgment in what John is saying. He uses that language and it sounds very, very prophetic. And so people listen. But actually at the heart of it, it's just now we need to connect. And it's interesting, haven't got time to unpack now, but how Jesus fulfills John's prophecies in ways that John undoubtedly didn't expect. Yes, judgment is coming. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, but there is good news in the midst. And actually, Jesus is going to do something, but it's not probably the way John sees it. But that very often, I think, is the nature of the prophetic. Is you deliver what God's given you, but you don't always, you sometimes imagine it's going to work out differently from the way it does. So anyway, it goes on. So even the tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked. So we're suddenly getting a sense in which somehow John's message is not just hitting those who came to search originally because the righteous were coming down to regions like Qumran, so they're looking for something because people are fed up with the way things are. But it's not just those people, but now even the tax collectors are coming. And they said, what should we do? And he says, collect nothing more above what's been prescribed to you. Now, it sounds to our way of thinking that therefore they must have been dishonest, But he's not. It's just in the ancient world. If I owed you something and I wasn't paying it, I had to hire somebody to go and get my money for me. And legally, they were allowed, if you like, to charge their fee to the person they had to get the money from. So they would go and they would set their fees very high, as you can imagine what it'd be like in the modern world. If you get your fee from the person you're suing, which does still happen, then you're going to sue them for a bigger amount than you really need to. And that goes right against the spirit of Deuteronomy, where you're not allowed usury of any sort, but it's a kind of a way of getting around that. And so the context here for the tax collectors is, take your expenses, take your fair price, because you do have to go and do it. But that's all. You don't need to do any more. You don't need to go further. And there are soldiers who are asking and saying, what should we do? And there's various debates. Is this Roman soldiers, or is it the soldiers that actually the tax collectors can't take with them? Because they do. They have kind of militia-type thugs who go around with them to bring in the money. Probably doesn't matter too much which way. But, to Luke's world, they would have understood the way that soldiers work. So don't shake people up and then report trouble. And most translations hide some of that a little bit, just in a rather fuzzy way they put it. So I've tried to make it in ways that we understand, that make as much sense. That the actual Greek word there for disrupting them is kind of shaking up. Don't shaking them up. But actually, I like the idea. You can imagine kind of causing trouble, and then you can go and report trouble, because when they cause trouble, you can go and report them to the authorities and so on. You can bring heavier fines on them. So don't make it worse, and be content with your wages. And the people were expectant, and they all wondered in their hearts about John and whether he was the Christ. So we've kind of seen the flow through, speaking like an old style prophet, like Amos at the feasts. And there's trouble coming, there's wrath coming, and you're a brood of vipers. But somehow it's good news. And actually, what we should be doing is we need to be preparing our hearts. And we saw the other week how in Josephus he tells us that in John's ministry, the baptism in one sense was more of a sign of actually that they are bearing fruit. And we get that tension. You've got to be bearing fruit, okay? So be baptized, but it's a sign of something, and actually still requires us the fruit. And people are responding to it, and they're getting excited by it, and they start to open their hearts. And they're expectant, and that's part of the key. They're now expectant for something, and they're wondering about John and whether he is the Christ. So it kind of moves on now. So John answered, saying to all of them, because John starts to realise, obviously, I in fact baptize you with water towards your rethinking things. In other words, it's part of this process, and you're going to be bearing fruit, but as part of this process, that's why I'm baptizing you with water. But after me, one who is mightier than I is coming, whose sandals I am not worthy to carry, nor stoop down to untie. And just one of the things that's kind of interesting there, so Matthew's Gospel says carry, Luke and Mark say about untying. I think it's in Mark where he actually says stoop down to untie. It's kind of one of those nice little interesting things where you can see, if you like, the original source, because in Aramaic, the word for carry and the word to untie sound exactly the same. They're spelt differently, but they sound the same. So one is carry is laset, and loose is lachelet. But if you say them kind of, they sound very, very similar. And so you can actually see how people are trying to remember, which way did he say it? Blessed are the peacemakers, or is it blessed are the cheesemakers? To quote a verse, to quote a quite a film that I shouldn't have seen, I'm sure. But it's very easy to kind of mishear. Interestingly, the version of the Aramaic, the Hebrew version of Matthew, which I held up the other day, it's still here on my bookshelf, actually has the Hebrew for untying, but the words are slightly differently to the one here in Aramaic, because it's fully Hebrew. But you can imagine very easily how the two have kind of blended together, and that's actually seen strangely. It's not as a contradiction or a mistake, but if you like, a little sign of proof of the original words that were being spoken. The fact that they come out so similarly when you're a listener. The fact we got those two slight nuances. But in this integrated text, I put the both together. So to carry, nor to stoop down and untie. And he's going to baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. And in that kind of context, you see the combination of washing, which is washing dirt off, but actually refining by fire is part of what's going on here. There's good news coming, because we've got to deal with sin, but it's not just about you getting into trouble for sin. It's actually that sin is being dealt with from you. It's being washed off you, which I'm kind of doing symbolically, but he's coming and he's going to actually sift it all out. And so it goes on in Luke's Gospel. His winnowing fork is in his hand to sift his threshing floor. And this is about chaff from wheat. And it's not that some people are chaff and some are wheat, which is our way of thinking, but actually in my life, there's stuff that's wheat and there's stuff that's chaff. And something about what Jesus is going to do, what the one who's coming is going to do, it's not just like symbolically trying to wash the marks off me. It's actually about refining out of me the bits in me that are of an old nature that needs to be got rid of, it, to those with fruit for eternal life, if you like, to gather his wheat into his barn, but he'll burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. And so, in fact, and with many other encouragements, he brought evangelion, he brought good news to the people. And so, remember, you've got to hear it this way. Although John's message starts very, you brood of vipers, it's good news. Why? Because actually, we can produce those fruits. And these fruits aren't just kind of sort of abstract things that you've just got to do to please God, but they are actually nice, they're kind. We actually feed each other, we clothe each other, we look after each other. So it's already got a love hermeneutic in the mix. And within that mix, you see, I'm washing you symbolically. It's only symbolic because you still have to do the work, you still have to produce the fruit. And the one who's coming, he comes with fire, but fire can be a good thing, and winnowing fork is a good thing, because yes, it burns up the rubbish, but actually that comes out from every single individual. We take out the bad and we burn it, and we keep the good and we store it. And that's the good news that John is bringing. And so it's into this kind of context, this kind of brief summary that we're given in the Gospels of this is John's message and his testimony that there's somebody else who's coming, because it's not me. And when they come, what I'm doing symbolically, they are going to be able to do so much better, because they come with the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is able to sift things, to thresh things. So it's not just that some people are good and some are bad, but even in average people who've got a bit of the good and a bit of the bad in them, he's going to sift the two and separate the two, store what's good, get rid of what's bad, and that's good news. So hopefully that's been kind of a useful, helpful take on the message of John the Baptist and his first testimony. And next time when we're together, we will see the arrival of Jesus into that context. And it is actually, I have to say, the baptism of Jesus is the gift that keeps on giving. It's a passage which there's no way we'll be able to do justice to, because it's so rich with prophetic meaning. But we'll take a bit of time looking at that next time. So until then, I'll say goodbyes now and see you soon. And I think my cup of tea is now gone cold, but my throat is beginning to go. So cheers.